Good evening. Power to the people. I'm what people used to call an old head. How quickly one becomes an old head. But in the last 3 years, and most dramatically in the last 10 months, this old head has been moved to be overcome almost with joy, to have lived to see the rebirth of a militant black movement that dares to take on the state. To take on the state in the form of the police. I'm not talking about the state of Mississippi or the state of Georgia, and it's not just in my city or in your city. It's taking on the cops everywhere that they occupy black communities. And it's also about black cops and black police chiefs and black mayors too. So many beautiful young people, young black people and young non-black people, have defied the personification of the state, the black corporate Democratic president, which makes this old head very, very happy. One of my most vivid, special memories was watching the split screen on television, I think it was PBS, on the evening that the St. Louis prosecutor announced that there was not going to be any indictment of the cop that killed Michael Brown in Ferguson. On one side of the television screen was President Obama, and he was droning on and on about respect for the rule of law and other such nonsense. On the other side of the screen was a scene from Ferguson, and there were young black people milling about. And then you saw the flickering of flames on the Ferguson side of the screen. And that was the answer to the county prosecutor, and that was the answer to the President of the United States. And that was a profound political statement by people in the street that the police could no longer count on having a monopoly on the use of force. A monopoly of force that they had used and abused for 2 generations to build a mass black incarceration state whose mission is to throw millions of black people in prison and to contain and terrorize black communities and to criminalize an entire people. Michelle Alexander calls that the new Jim Crow. I call it the mass black incarceration state because in many ways it defines black people's relationship to the state and their relationship to the larger society. It also warps relationships between and among black people, with crippling effects on black social cohesion and therefore on black political activity as well. This is the fight that had to be waged, a battle against the state itself in the form of its armed enforcers of people destroying national policy. In the wake of the Ferguson police response to the protests against the killing of Michael Brown last summer, corporate media started talking about the problem and describing it as a problem of the militarization of police. And by militarization, they meant the clothing that the cops wore, and the gear, and the weapons that they carried, and the armored vehicles that they rode around in. As if you dressed the police differently and hid away their automatic weapons and their tanks, if you made them look less like soldiers, the problem would be solved and we'd have a nice, good police force. But militarization is not just about equipments, and it's not about uniforms. It is most profoundly about the mission of the police. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense back in 1966 described the police as an army of occupation in the black community. That was 3 years before the establishment of the first SWAT team. The cops didn't look like soldiers then, but they did act, they did behave, they did function as an occupation army in the black community. That was their mission. Their mission was to terrorize, suppress, and contain black people. The cops carry out that mission very well, and they do so without tanks and without automatic weapons. Very few black people are killed by cops who shoot automatic rifles from the tops of tanks. Most of the killings are done the old-fashioned way, with cops in regular uniforms firing pistols. The local police mission became a national policy with the passage of a so-called Crime Act in 1968, and that created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, called the LEAA. The LEAA pumped billions of dollars into expanding and arming and training the local police departments. By the way, that bill was signed by LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. The expanded federal role in local policing and the war on drugs, of course, laid the foundation for the national policy, not local, but national policy of mass black incarceration, which dates roughly to about 1970. That's when you see the incarceration rates going through the roof. The mass black incarceration regime was the United States government's response to the black liberation movements of the 60s. And today's emerging movement is black people's response to the mass black incarceration state. Now, at yesterday's plenary, I heard people talking a great deal about democracy and the value of democracy. Well, this is a struggle for democracy. And democracy cannot exist in communities that are occupied by hostile forces. When whole communities, when a whole people are systematically targeted for suppression by the state, bourgeois democracy is not the answer. What is needed is self-determination for those people who have been targeted. The police must be subordinated to, answerable to, and chosen by the black communities that they serve. That means black community control of the police. This system, the one that we have now, that was put in motion about 45 years ago, is not reformable. It has been very successful in its mission, so successful that 1 out of every 8 prison inmates on planet Earth is an African American. There are more people of color in prison in the United States than the entire prison population of China, which has 4.5 times as many people as the United States. So we see that by the numbers, by the metrics, the U.S. is by far the biggest police state in the world. By those same numbers, it is manifest that racial repression is the organizing principle, the central mission of the U.S. criminal justice system. That's why it is not reformable. The Black Misleadership class, and you know we at Black Agenda Report like to talk about the Black Misleadership class. That is a cohort that came into full flower about 1970. That's coterminous with the creation of the national black mass incarceration regime. They have been willing cogs in the racist machinery, and they have collaborated fully with the mass black incarceration state. Black-led cities have contributed more than their share of their constituents to the gulag. Half of the Congressional Black Caucus back in 1986 voted in favor of these 100-to-1 penalties for crack cocaine. And they have gotten even worse over time, especially under the first black president. Last June, when the Grayson Amendment to halt the Pentagon's transfers of military gear to local police departments, last year when it was up for a vote, of the 40 black voting congresspersons, 32 either voted against the Grayson Amendment or abstained. What that means is that 80% of the Congressional Black Caucus, 4 out of 5 of them, supported the militarization of the police, including the black congressman who represents Ferguson, Missouri. So this generation of activists is in a confrontation with not only the US state in the form of the police, but also with the black misleadership class, which wants nothing but to prove its usefulness to the people who rule America. Elements of this movement have already clashed repeatedly with these misleaders in Ferguson and in Baltimore and in places across the country. I believe that the most important breakthrough so far that this young movement has made is its readiness to take on the black misleadership class, who act as surrogates for the oppressor. And finally, if this movement succeeds in creating a crisis of governance, which it must do, then it will be treated as insurgent by the counterinsurgency apparatus. And when you get treated as an insurgent by that apparatus, there will come long-term political prisoners. And yet, we have not yet freed all of our political prisoners from the last movement of more than 40 years ago. So, this new movement must prioritize our prisoners, our past prisoners, and our prisoners to come. Free all political prisoners. Because there's going to be a lot more of them. Power to the people.